Martin, airport information, Papa 1848 Zulu. Wind calm, visibility 9er, sky condition, ceiling 1,700.
We're in Southern California today on the ground at Fullerton, east of Los Angeles. We're about to do a fairly substantial cross-country flight using the 182, basically because it's pretty fast. We've got an autopilot, so we're going to use that to basically just manage the headings we're going to fly. We're going to do one land away down the coast at Palomar, flying VFR with a bit of weather, using air traffic control procedures as realistically as possible, trying to get as close as possible to the realistic cockpit workload. This is going to involve a fair bit of radio work, and I'll be using the Saitek panels to manage the radios. Just a little bit on what to expect on the radios. We're going to need to talk to a ground controller and a tower controller. The only other service we're going to talk to is the flight following service. This will give us traffic advisory information. So we make initial contact with SoCal Approach, and most of the action is going to be handoffs. You'll notice lots of different handoffs to maintain the flight following as we go down the coast and then up through the LA basin. So not much to do except listen out. First leg's fairly easy to navigate. We're basically flying down the coast to Palomar. It's about 60 miles to Palomar. On the way we'll be looking out for some fairly distinctive landmarks. I have done a bit of a flight plan, I've made some marks on the map. We'll be looking out for El Toro, which is a marine air base. Very distinctive runway configuration, so a good landmark. There's a fairly distinctive headland about halfway down the coast as well. And there's also a power station at San Onofre and a couple other airfields off to the left. A lot of airspace around, but we're going to fly at 4,500 feet. We're basically going over the top of it. Now you notice one of the things that happens whenever there's a handoff between controllers is they give an altimeter reading. You'll notice that I reset the altimeter every time I get one of those. I should say this weather is fairly marginal for VFR. The way I'm flying it here is probably not strictly legal. I ought to really be manoeuvring around these clouds. There's plenty of gaps. Could get on top as long as I can see the ground. That's legal. There are certain minimum distances from cloud to maintain, which I'm clearly not doing here. Not a particularly sensible way to proceed in an area with such heavy traffic. So just setting the VOR here, this is dialing in Oceanside, give us a bit of a cross-check possibility for making sure of our position. We don't really need radio nav aids on this leg of the trip, fairly difficult to get lost, as long as we've got the Pacific Ocean on the right and some 12,000 foot mountains somewhere on the left. Just in terms of airspace, we do have to be slightly cautious. There's two restricted areas about 2/3 of the way towards Palomar. These are military restricted areas. We're well above the ceiling of Southerly one, which straddles the coast in the region of the power station. What we want to avoid is drifting too far inland away from the road, because right next to that there's a restricted area that goes right up to 15,000 feet. Just on the radios, I'm flying almost exclusively on one COM radio. I use COM 2 basically to get the ATIS without having to change frequencies. I've also got one nav radio in this stack, and that's what I use for the VORs if I need to do any cross-checking. Fourth radio in my stack's a transponder, so we'll be using that. We'll have a couple of times when we'll be given a transponder code, basically when we start flight following or when we terminate that. So you notice that for a lot of this trip we're using the autopilot, using it in a very unsophisticated way. This is quite a twitchy aircraft in roll, at least in the simulator, at the best of times. And we are flying with weather on today. This is real world weather. So it's quite difficult to get it to hold a heading. So we're using the autopilot, basically just to use the heading hold function. So what I'm doing here is I'm just about over Oceanside, which is to the north of Palomar. I'm getting Palomar ATIS on COM 2, so I'm not switching off away from the flight following frequency. Probably is a good time to manoeuvre around some of these clouds. It starts to be quite important that we can find the airport. Got a good picture there of Carlsbad. It's a nice distinctive inlet there, very good marker for the airport. Okay, so we're on the ground in Palomar, going to taxi to parking, and later on this afternoon we're going to fly the return leg. Leaving Palomar, we're going to fly east for a little while and then turn north. Need to be careful of terrain from here on. There's some fairly big mountains around and there is quite a lot of cloud down here. Navigation isn't quite as easy as flying down the coast, but there are quite a few distinctive lakes around here, so we're going to make these the primary landmarks. There are a couple of different ways we could have gone for this leg of the trip. Chose to go east for this first part, partly because it gets us away from that restricted area. By flying east, we've got some fairly good landmarks. We cross the major highway, going to turn north at a lake, and that sets us up for quite a good VFR trip. We've got a road to the left all the way. We've got another lake, fairly substantial sized lake, Matthews, this side of Corona. Other major landmarks, we've got Elsinore, another big lake, which should be off to the left. Santiago Peak, which should be off to the left, fairly large mountain. The scenery you're looking at here, Mega Scenery X, Southern California, excellent scenery. Certainly flying at this height with a bit of weather on, very realistic. Probably would normally be quite clear out here. Further west into the LA basin, often much more smoggy, and even if the sky's clear, visibility is often very limited, particularly when you're only a few thousand feet. So just on terrain, as long as we don't drift too far off the track, 5,500 feet is a safe cruising altitude. Of course, we are heading for airspace again, and we'll need to climb to 6,000 around March Air Force Base, just in case we're not completely on track. Then shortly after that, over Lake Matthews, we're going to descend way down to about 2,500 feet before flying over Corona. That keeps us out of Ontario airspace. We could just stay south of Corona and we'll miss the edge of the airspace, but it depends on the weather. It's a decent landmark, the airfield, so aim to fly overhead. Other thing to know, this is the afternoon, the sun's going to be quite low on the way home, and we're going to be flying more or less directly into it, so it might be quite difficult to see. So as a safeguard, we can dial in, there's a VOR at Seal Beach, which is pretty close to Fullerton, if we need that. So there's another handoff. Because we're on SoCal approach frequency, but we're only getting a flight following service. We're getting traffic advice, we're not getting any instructions. You'll hear other aircraft being manoeuvred around, given headings and altitudes. They're flying IFR, of course. And to do it realistically, I have these Saitek panels. They look pretty good. Each panel in the stack can manage 2 radios with an active and standby frequency. Incidentally, that's active and standby frequency we're modelled in the aircraft. In this aircraft, COM1 doesn't have a standby frequency, which means when you use the tuning knob, it just tunes the active frequency. In other words, it doesn't add features to the radio that the radio doesn't have. I have to say, these Saitek radio panels, not up to the job at all. In use, they're so sloppy. The wheels click as you turn them, great. Unfortunately, a click doesn't necessarily correspond to one increment in the frequency. This is particularly noticeable when you're tuning the transponder. You tune each digit separately, and you'd expect one click to increment the digit by 1 or decrement it by 1. Sometimes it does, sometimes it increments or decrements it by 2, sometimes none. Sometimes you just cannot get the digit you want, and you've got to wiggle the thing backwards and forwards until you get it. This is not made up. This is me actually trying to dial in 1200, and it's just ridiculous. Totally unusable. Barely acceptable for changing radio frequencies. A bit of jiggling required, but it shouldn't be. These things cost over £100 each, and they should work. So just turning overhead our next checkpoint here to another lake next to French Valley, and we're going to be turning northwest towards Lake Matthews. Not really making any formal effort to calculate wind drift or ground speed. We're sufficiently visual to just go by reading landmarks and matching them to the map. So eventually it becomes fairly clear why I can't see Lake Matthews. I've got the Paradise VOR in on nav1, taking a bit of a cross check from there and discovering I'm overhead March Air Force Base. We're quite okay with that. We're at 7,000 feet, well above their airspace, and it's a pretty good, fairly unmistakable landmark. Rather than proceed en route from here, I'm going to try and stick to the plan, so I'm going to fly from here to Lake Matthews and pick up the plan. So you can see visibility in these conditions is not ideal. We are getting some of that haze. Thankfully the cloud cover is more or less receding behind us, but we are getting some of that haze. We're going to be heading into the sun. The sun's quite low, late afternoon. It's not until you get to this time of day that you begin to see something of the traffic in the sky. A lot of chatter on the radio. It's very hard to see anything in daylight in FSX unless you're really up close, but now we're starting to see, just swarms of planes really. So Corona's up ahead. From there it's more or less due west to Fullerton.
Fullerton Tower, Cessna, November 320 Charlie Alpha is 7 miles east with Victor to land. Cessna 0 Charlie Alpha, cleared to land, runway 6.
With a sloppy approach here, frankly. But good enough. We're down in one piece.